Now, after this, the second kind of poetry that Coleridge talks about, and I'm going to quote him here. He says the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. And real in this sense, they have been to every human being who, from whatever source of delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. So, from this definition, it becomes very clear to us that A. Coleridge certainly believes that as human beings, we may have had some kind of a supernatural experience, some kind of an inexplicable experience at some point or another um, in our lifetime, right? And in those situations, the emotions that we have experienced would also be very different, right? They would be these could be life altering situations. These could be uh, completely perspective changing situations, right? So these are not situations that are from our natural world. These are situations that are from our supernatural world. So he says the excellence aimed at. So what was the objective of this kind of poetry? Was that it created an interest of in the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions. So in such supernatural situations, our emotions are also dramatic, they are overplayed. We probably never will be able to experience these emotions in normal everyday circumstances, the kinds that we experience in such situations, which are supposing them as real. I mean, they are not real, but let us suppose that they are real. And uh, real in the sense that he says, I'm sure that every human being will be able to imagine or take their imagination to that level where you realize that this situation could be possible in another realm. And that is, and when you are in that state, that is what will enable you to appreciate this kind of a work. And what is the requirement for this? Willing suspension of disbelief. Now, what is willing suspension of disbelief? It simply means that when we go to, and we all do this, by the way, we all practice and we all engage in willing suspension of disbelief. Let me tell you how. When we go to watch a cinema, yeah, watch a movie, for example, when we go to the cinema, say it's a horror movie or a movie with a lot of a thriller movie, right? We know that this is all created, this is all constructed, right? It's not real, but we still cover our faces. We say, oh, I don't want to see what happens after this. And then we scream and we are scared. Many of us are, right? I'm not saying all of us are, but it is difficult to within that space, within that cinematic space, or the space that we have created where we are one with what is happening on the screen, it is difficult within that space to separate ourselves from the events that we are witnessing, that the events that are unfolding. So though we know that it is not real, that this has been shot and there's a team, there's a camera, I mean, there are several cameras that are doing their job, and there's a director and a script writer, and these are actors, still we would like to believe in the in whatever is happening in that diegetic space, right? In that cinematic screen space, we will ourselves, we allow ourselves to believe in the narrative that we are witnessing, despite knowing that it is not true. So it is a willing suspension of disbelief. So we suspend our belief for some time, and we do it very willingly, right? So in the sense, I can just sit back and say, oh, I don't believe all of this, but I don't entertain that disbelief. I suspend the disbelief for some time, and I do it willingly. No one is forcing me to do it, right? I am so taken in by the narrative, I'm so taken in by the story, the events that are unfolding, that I take that decision. I make that, uh, maybe I don't do it consciously. It just happens involuntarily, that I am willing to set aside my critical, judgmental, analytical, rational self, and I'm willing to keep aside my disbelief, and I'm willing to believe in whatever is unfolding in front of my eyes. So, this is the second kind of poetry, where you know this situation can't be true, and yet you allow yourself to believe it, right? So this is the kind of poetry which Coleridge engaged in, and which Coleridge brought out. Hmm. Right. So, Coleridge, besides other things, what he does is, now when Wordsworth wrote his genre of poems, he came under a lot of attack, because obviously, like I said, he was charting radical territory. He was uh, he was challenging age old conventions, age old literary conventions related to production or creation of literary works. So instead of using lofty language and very elevated diction, Wordsworth just used very common everyday language to write his poetry, which he said was intended for the common man. Because why should poetry be just a source of pleasure for the rich man or the educated man or the enlightened man? It should be for the commoner also. It should be for the villager. It should be for the rustic. And Wordsworth came under, had to take a lot of flack from contemporary critics for writing the way he did, for using the language that he did. And in fact, Coleridge comes up with a robust defense of Wordsworth's everyday language. So that is something which he does in chapter 14. So, despite the fact that he has his personal differences with Wordsworth, he still comes to the defense of Wordsworth. Then he goes on to distinguish between factual narrative, prose, and poetry. We already saw how he does that. He says prose and poetry could be similar in terms of the elements. So they are elementally similar, but they are very different when it comes to their structure and their intent. Factual narrative, of course, the motive of factual narrative is to convey the truth, whereas prose and poetry, they are meant to instruct and they are meant to delight, right? And for poetry in particular, he believes that meter should not be cosmetic. Now, what does that mean? Meter should not be superimposed on a poetic piece just for the sake of creating some kind of a rhythm or some kind of a rhyme scheme. Meter should not be superimposed. Instead, he says rhyme, meter, diction, all of these should be integral and organic to a poem for permanent pleasure. So they should be a part of the poem. They should be in they should just be a part of the whole. As if you remove the rhyme and the meter, the poem is just going to fall apart, right? So that is how he looks at rhyme, meter, and diction in a poem. And then you have poetry. Here there's a very interesting graphic which I have for you. So here you have the right in poetry. What happens is, and this is to interpret what Coleridge is trying to say, that the writer reaches the reader's heart. It's a direct passage path to the reader's heart through poetry. But in other texts, the intellect is involved. So the mind comes in the picture. The mind processes what it is reading, and then of course, whatever is filtered reaches the heart, and then the reader, of course, takes in whatever the writer is trying to say. But here it's not just the heart; it's also the mind that is involved. But in poetry, it's primarily the heart, the emotions that are affected, the emotions that are experienced, and the heart that kind of is involved in reading a poem. So that's the kind of engagement one has with poetry. So I hope you found this session beneficial. This was about Coleridge's chapter 14 from Biographia Literaria Part 2. And very soon I'll be back with another session for you. Till then, bye bye and take care. Thank you so much for your patience.